everyone. I'm Elizabeth Corey, and I'm here as the founder of beatingtrauma.com to talk to you about our trauma responses today. It is Tuesday noon Eastern, and today in particular, I want to talk about dissociation. And dissociation is a word that is very mainstream at this point, which is amazing. Just how far we've come. I mean, when I say mainstream, I mean in psychology. I don't mean in the whole world, but in psychology, it's fairly mainstream now. But for those of us who speak in inner parts, I'm going to talk about signs, like the signs of dissociation. So what I'm really saying is the signs that we're in our controller. So the controller is the part that runs dissociation. And it makes dissociation pretty hard to see, even though when I talk to you today about the signs, you're going to be like, that's pretty obvious. But we get distracted. The mind plays tricks on us because the controller is often in charge of the mind. And so we don't recognize things that actually, in fact, may be a bit obvious if we were sort of watching ourselves from the outside. For example, we might see it a little more clearly. So it is very important to go over these signs as many times as we need to. Now, I will also say that when I started this list, I didn't realize how big it was going to get and how fast it was going to get there. So I may not actually get to all of these signs today. We might have 2 live streams about this, but I'm also considering doing a series of reels, each reel talking about a sign. So I'm still debating that. But what I can tell you is there's a lot of signs. We may not get to them all today. Plus, you guys are probably going to add things that are going to be awesome, and I may want to include those as well. This is going to be a process of which I have yet to really determine what it's going to look like. I'm going to go through as many of these signs of dissociation as I can. And again, for those of us speaking parts work, that means signs of the controller. So the first one I want to talk about today, and yes, I'm starting off quickly because I have so many here, is anxiety. Now, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really help me much, Elizabeth, because anxiety shows up in a lot of different ways, and it is true that it does. What I have discovered is when I personally start to feel the signs of anxiety in my system and what it looks like for me, I know my controller is very close to the surface and is likely dissociating me from something. So sometimes I refer to anxiety as the battle of the parts. That's one of the little phrases I use. And what that generally means is one part is trying to share something with us and the controller is trying to block it. So that's why I refer to it as battle of the parts. Could it be 2 different parts? It could be. But most of the time, the controller is in the battle if we're feeling anxiety. So what could your anxiety be feeling like? I mean, it could be any number of things. Of course, there are the traditional, the heart racing, struggling to breathe properly, full-on panic attacks are a part of this as well. So, I mean, we need to consider those. Just because we're having a very severe reaction in the body doesn't mean it isn't emotional at its foundation. I really like to stress that because the controller will not only panic you in an attempt to push emotions and parts back down, but then they will tell you that the panic is a sign that something is seriously physically wrong and you need to go to the emergency room, because to the controller, that is a distraction. A proper level distraction that will keep you from exploring what might be underneath it. So if you're having anxiety in any form, and again, for a lot of us, we may have symptoms of anxiety that don't look very traditional, and we may not even know that it is anxiety. Or we're so removed from the body, we don't even sense the more traditional signs of anxiety, which definitely happens as well. So my first sign that we're in dissociation is anxiety. So the next one is that we think we're grounded because, again, that's a really popular phrase, right? You want to be grounded. So we think we're grounded, but we don't actually feel anything. Okay. So this is another trick. And by the way, almost all of these are going to have some kind of tricky element to them because that's how the controller does usually operate in our systems, which doesn't make you feel great to know that you have parts that are sort of tricking you. But most of us do. And that's because they take on the characteristics of the people who were abusive towards us when we were children. So we will have parts that trick us. So the way in which we get tricked on this one is that people love to say that being grounded means you feel good. That is a trick. That is actually not the case. As a matter of fact, one of the things I love to talk about the most is that when we are grounded, we generally don't feel great. Okay. And that's why we have to ground in little bits and pieces over time, because it isn't something we're going to be able to maintain for a long time. When we ground, we're going to connect with the body. That's the point of grounding. We're going to connect with the emotion that lives in the body. We're going to feel things. We may even dabble in getting some memories back. We may get some visuals, or we may get a body memory. We may feel some pain that, let's face it, has probably been there the whole time, but we didn't notice it until we grounded into the body. So if you're telling yourself you're grounded, but you don't feel anything, which to us is often sort of equated to feeling good. I mean, that's just the way it works. We feel good when we don't feel anything, because everything we feel is usually some kind of traumatic emotion. So feeling nothing feels good to us, right? Even though there is this element of, gosh, I'm like sitting in this big black hole, and the numbness really does feel like we're kind of missing out on life. But to us, that's good enough a lot of the time. So if you think you're grounded, but you don't feel anything, so this is the game I play. Am I grounded or am I numb? Okay. It's a very important game. We need to play it. We need to ask ourselves that question as often as we can. Am I grounded or am I numb? And the best way to tell if you are in fact numb is to ground. Because if you start grounding and you feel differently, then you know you were numb. And this is, honestly, I do this multiple times a day, right? And does that make me grounded all the time? No, because the controller can just jump you right back out of the body the minute you're done and the minute you're no longer aware. So it is something we need to repeat a lot. All right. So that's my number 2 sign. My number 3 sign here is that we are obsessing or ruminating about something that we really do know is not a huge deal. Okay, now I am not talking about complex trauma, okay? When I say obsessing and ruminating about something that either isn't a big deal, or the act of obsessing and ruminating about it is actually not going to do anything for us, right? So when I am obsessing and ruminating about what I need to do the next day at 3 a.m., there is absolutely no value in that obsessing and ruminating at all, right? So that's really what I'm talking about here. When the mind just seems to be going about things that on the surface may be important. You know, yeah, tomorrow I have that meeting, and tomorrow I need to work this out, and tomorrow I need to get to the to-do list. Okay, probably, right? I probably do. But the actual act of obsessing and ruminating about it isn't actually getting me closer to getting those things done, right? It's just because I already know. Generally speaking, what we obsess and ruminate about, we already know what needs to happen, and thinking about it again and again and again and again and again actually doesn't provide us with any value. Every once in a while, we might have a useful thought about how to get something done. But what I will say is it's pretty rare, because most obsessing and ruminating is repetitive in nature. We've already been there. We've already done that, right? So when we are obsessing and ruminating, it is a way that the controller pulls us out of the body and into the frontal lobe. If we're in the frontal lobe and totally connected there, we oftentimes are distracted from the body. We are not connected with our emotions. We are, in fact, dissociated, right? So it becomes a way of distracting us. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but when you're doing things that don't require a lot of thought, right? Okay, so you're not working on your Excel spreadsheet to do your taxes, which is generally when you're using, right, the frontal lobe. Taxes are obviously right in the front of like my being, my thoughts, everything right now, because it just happened. But like if you're not doing something like that where you really truly need to use that super strong frontal lobe aspect of yourself, most of the rest of the time, let's say you're doing laundry, you're cooking dinner, but it's something you've made a million times. You're driving the same route you always go. You're taking a shower, whatever it might be. Those are the times when we are most likely, actually the other time is right before we go to sleep, which is why it can take us so long to fall asleep. Those are the moments when the ruminating and obsessing can get particularly bad. Because if we weren't doing that, we could be present, right? Like we could be in the body and not really using the mind. But if we're not really using the mind, we're much more connected to our emotion, right? We're much more connected when we're present, when we're grounded to the body. And that is terrifying to the controller, right? So that's really important. The next thing that I want to talk about as far as signs are concerned is we don't seem to have the time to do anything emotional, connected, creative. So we'll often, when we start thinking about doing things like that, okay, connecting to our emotions, maybe as a part of our healing, or doing something creative that really brings us into the present moment and connects us with ourselves deeply, we will hear in the mind something to the effect of, that's a waste of time, right? Okay. So when we hear things like, that's a waste of time, okay, that is the controller. I like to say that controllers can be extremely time-based, and they will use time against us. So when we're really, really trying to avoid the body, because the controller is super active in those moments, when we're really trying to avoid the body, we will talk about things that will get us more in the body as a waste of time. So watch for that kind of language in your head. It's usually a trick. Controllers are really good at using time as a reason to not do the things they don't want you to do. So watch for that. Because to the controller, if there isn't some kind of end goal that's like really amazing, like life-changing, like you're going to become the best at this particular task in the world and everybody is just going to love you for it, then the controller will say it's a waste of time. But I'll be honest, if it's something that connects us to the body, they might just say that anyway, to be honest. So that's something to watch for. So let's see. The next sign I want to talk about is we are super, super busy and we don't have time to rest. Okay. So this is, and I'll be honest, most of the time when I talk to my clients and they say, I have been really, really busy, they never say I've been busy doing things that weren't important, because the controller's not stupid. If they're going to keep us busy, they're going to keep us busy with things that we know are important and need to be done. Now, they might decide to do it in the most detailed, longest possible path if they don't have other things that they can use to distract us. And I typically, when we start examining what's been keeping us busy, we can sort of find those places where we're like, oh yeah, I did make that probably a bit more complex than I needed to at the time. Or I did a little bit more than I was really supposed to do there. That has a tendency to be a part of the busyness. Sometimes, though, the busyness will just be running around, doing little things, fixing little things. Honestly, a lot of the times, we're not even in the body enough to know what we're doing. We're just doing stuff, right? We're just busy. We're just doing stuff. We try to sit down, and then the list starts forming in the head, and we have to get up and go do the things that are in our head, right? This is all an attempt to keep us away from the present moment, to keep us from connecting with ourselves on any kind of deep level, right? These things are a way of doing that. So this is a dissociated thing. And sometimes I find that this can be like connected to things like forgetfulness. So we hear about forgetfulness a lot, and it gets a lot of different names and a lot of different stories, this forgetfulness. So for example, we hear like mama brain, foggy brain. Oh, I'm getting older, so I'm forgetting things all the time, maybe there's, and then if you have things like dementia or Alzheimer's that run in your family, it can really freak you out when you start to feel forgetful about things. But typically, when we are being kept really, really busy, we're also experiencing quite a bit of forgetfulness. So my number one forgetfulness experience is walking into a room, knowing when I walked into the room why I was going to go into the room. But then when I get into the room, I do something else and then I leave. And when I get back where I was, I go, oh, I didn't do the thing that I was going to do, right? So some people will just, they'll laugh that off. They'll say, oh, just being forgetful. The truth is, that is absolutely a sign of dissociation. The controller has us in the mind and they're running us around. And dissociation is the number one cause of forgetfulness. And to be honest, I do believe wholeheartedly that things like Alzheimer's and dementia are caused by a lifetime of dissociations. There's a connection between things that we forget and dissociation in general. And the hope of that is that if we can bring it back to the dissociation and we can work on the dissociation and become more grounded, we have the potential to avoid longer term, like a big issues with these illnesses that do seem to make us more permanently forgetful. So we want to take the time to address the dissociation and what the dissociation is trying to block for us now. And first of all, of course, we have to know that it's there, right? So we have to stop sort of minimizing the forgetfulness as just brain fog, just mama brain, getting old. We have to stop using that language, which is controller language, and start really going, I wonder what I am trying to block right now. Like, I wonder what I'm trying to not connect to in my body. Like, what am I trying not to see, right? So these are very, very important things we need to look at for ourselves so that we can begin to heal some of the trauma that actually may be creating a lot of that forgetfulness that kind of keeps us on that busy hamster wheel all the time because we're like, I have something to do. Now I don't remember, so I'll do something else. And then I'll come back and I'll be like, oh yeah, I wanted to do that. And then I'll go back into that room and then I'll forget and I'll do something else, right? It's just this cycle of doing things, but not really knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it. And like, some cases where you even are in the moment, you're just like really gone. That's the stuff that tells us we're dissociated and we are enmeshed with that controller, which is the inner part, really does try to keep us away from ourselves, right? So I really encourage you to consider that the next time you're forgetful. I just realized that I walked into a room and left without doing the thing that I wanted to do. What's happening? Like, how am I disconnected right now? Asking the question, how can I get grounded here? Your controllers, by the way, will hate every idea that I'm giving you today. So if you're feeling a lot of resistance in your system, this is a good time to start writing from that resistance, really connecting with that resistance to understanding that you are dissociated and potentially where that dissociation is coming from. Because one of the things we hear a lot about is dissociation is brought up as these really like extreme scenarios, the kinds of things that M. Night Shyamalan makes movies about. And don't even get me started on the irresponsibility of that. That's for another video. But the truth is dissociation usually shows up in some kind of pretty everyday ways. And the reason why it looks like everyday experiences is because almost all of us are dissociating. It's not this really uncommon thing that only happens in extreme scenarios. We're all trying to get away from ourselves at least a little bit. So recognizing that is, it's just so helpful. It's so helpful for the world in general if we can see that happening. So I do have a couple more that I want to talk about. Like I said, when I made this list, I was like, well, it just keeps going. So let's talk about some of these. The next one, we aren't even sure that anything happened or believe we might actually be overreacting. Okay, so remember, the controller absorbs a lot of the gaslighting that happened to us as children. When we are experiencing significant dissociation, we may also be experiencing this doubt and denial coming in really strongly. And that doubt and denial is going to use phrases against us that were used against us when we were children, which is why it's so hard to figure it out, because it is in and of itself a part of our trauma. We may have forgotten that these kind of phrases were used against us as children, which makes it easier to believe the gaslighting when it's happening now, because we don't recognize the origin. As soon as we start to recognize where that gaslighting came from, well, then we're gonna kind of feel like we're gonna recognize the lack of credibility in what we're saying to ourselves, and that's very helpful. Jan is saying, I'm realizing how dissociated I am on a daily basis. I innately feel I need to get in touch with my body and feelings. The topic is spot on. Yes, and honestly, I can't even stress how important it is to get in the body, even if you can only pull it off for 30 seconds at a time. Like, the controller is going to tell you that that's no big deal and that's not doing any good. Another trick, similar to the one we're just talking about with the gaslighting. It's just a different form of gaslighting. The truth is, 30 seconds in your body every day when you are used to never being in your body is massive and has a massive impact on you. I started this whole journey by just spending my half an hour commute keeping my thoughts on the present moment instead of letting myself ruminate. Just a half hour every day. Now, did I make it the whole half hour? Heck no, I didn't. I was in and out, in and out, in and out. But I kept building on it until I could get there. And and my controller told me the whole time that this was useless and pointless. It wasn't actually doing any good at all. But it started this whole journey for me. So it was doing a lot. It was the beginning of major life change, right? So don't listen to the controller when they say, this is nothing and no big deal. Rose is saying, I always feel like I'm overreacting. Yes, and that is how you gaslight yourself. And by the way, you're not alone, okay? Most people are doubting or throwing denial at themselves constantly in their heads about, why am I so emotional about this? It really wasn't that bad and not that much happened. And I really just need to get over it and move on. And the past is in the past. And I mean, I could go on and on and on about the self-gaslighting. And that's not just because I hear this stuff from my clients. I've said all of this to myself, right? So, yeah. And when you say you need other people to tell you that you're not overreacting, oftentimes that's because when you were a child, you were told that what you thought wasn't really right or valid or important, probably because as a child, you may have even tried to say, hey, something's not right here. And what you were told was, well, you're wrong. So you learn not to trust yourself, basically. And that's the self-gaslighting that's still happening. The more that you write from the controller, and this is true for all of these signs, the more that we are writing from the controller and all the things that they're saying, especially the gaslighting and denial, the better we're going to feel about our story. But it's a process, and it's fairly long and involved, but it works. Over time, it does work. The more you write from the controller, the better. I can't stress it enough. As a matter of fact, I've been writing from the controller today, and I need to do more of it because I can tell my controller is very active in my life today. The next sign I want to talk about is that we will have body aches. Body aches are often a sign that we are dissociated. So we sort of left the body, but all the things that are in the body are still there, and they're still trying to get to us, but the controller is shoving that stuff down. Some of the most common body aches we will have when we're dissociated are headache, and this is particularly true if we're blocking the controller, okay? Headaches, jaw aches, neck and shoulder aches, and hip pain are very, very common signs that the controller is actively stopping the emotional communication from the body at that moment. Again, this is where controller writing can be very, very good. I'm not saying it's going to instantly release your headache, but over time, it can, and it does. I have experiences all the time where I'm able to release pain in the body through controller writing. And the last sign, and believe it or not, this was my whole list today. I can't believe I'm getting to all of them, but I am. We think we're done. Okay, now what does that mean? We think we're done. what I'm referring to here is, okay, I'm healed. I'm done. I've gotten all my memories. I've felt all my emotions. I'm totally fine now. The rest of my life's going to be rainbows and unicorns. Normally, when we feel this way, we are numbed out. But it is a very common feeling. Like my controller will tell me, honestly, every single time I get a memory back, that it's the last memory. They tell me this constantly. Is it ever the last memory? Well, so far, I will tell you that it has not ever been the last memory. But my controller will say, without a doubt, that this one is. And that off, sometimes they trick me with it. Sometimes they trick me and I'm like, oh, great, I'm done. And it, for a moment, it keeps me from looking for what else is there. But then I realize, no, I am in fact not done. And I do look for the next thing that's there. So these are a lot of signs of dissociation that you may be experiencing. What I mean by that is it's signs that your controller is currently in charge, right? So try to work with these some. I'm thinking I will probably do a series of reels that kind of walks through each one of them. The reels are really short. It's not good for someone who likes to talk a lot like me, but I'll do like individual reels and try to kind of sum up each one of these signs and then we can kind of go from there. But this is going to be the most detailed information on the topic here today. If, as I continue to think about it, I come up with a whole bunch more signs, maybe we'll do another live stream on the topic. But I've just been feeling like this controller energy right now is really, really strong for me and my clients. And so I thought it would be good to bring this topic forward. So thank you all so much for being here. And I will plan to talk to you next week, same time, same place. Thank you all again.